Greetings, everybody. My name is Jim Roberts. I'm the publisher of the 74. I want to go through a little bit of history before we dive right in. Not long history, just a year and a half. So as painful as 2020 was, 2021 hit us with a vengeance, particularly the education sector. If successive surges of COVID-19 weren't enough, we got an equally destabilizing surge of politics, engulfing schools, school boards across the country. At first, the battles were about mask mandates, but soon the fight spread to the 1619 Project, CRT, gender issues, banning books, culture wars, teacher surveillance, and the new phrase, parental rights. Suddenly, educators were under siege. Perhaps this was inevitable, given all of the turmoil over the 2020 election and what happened on January 6th. Or perhaps, maybe, as the New Yorker wrote a couple of weeks ago, a fascinating essay, all of this inevitability could stem from the war over Darwinism that erupted 100 years ago. Then, as now, America was witnessing an epic struggle between the rights of parents and the power of the state. Which brings us to this panel, which we've titled Public Education is Under Attack, Education Politics and the 2020 Cycle. So joining me here today, Emma Bloomberg, founder, CEO of Murmuration, Victoria Fosdal, she's Communications Director for Democrats for Education Reform, aka DEFR, and Derrell Bradford, President of 50 CAN, aka the 50 State Campaign for Achievement Now. I'm grateful to all of them for being here, and I love to talk about politics. That's what we're going to do. So Emma comes to us bearing some news in the form of a poll which Murmuration released today. There's a ton of fascinating stuff in it, and I want to start with her because so much of it is interesting and so much of it is pertinent to both the politics of this moment and the politics of the midterms. Emma, if you could, what was like the most startling thing that you discovered in the poll?
Startling thing. Well, first of all, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. And thanks to my fellow panelists. As Jim said, we released a poll this morning. You can go to murmuration.org/benchmark if you'd like to dig in on the crosstabs and find your own startling facts from said poll, or read about it in the 74, because that also dropped today. Thank you, Jim. I guess for me, the main takeaways from this poll, we do polling in two different ways. One is very much, for those of you who know Murmuration, we have our national polling project and we do polling that's tied to model building for our partners. This polling is separate from that. This is our public opinion polling, which we do to really help to make sure that our partners understand how voters are feeling about issues around public K-12 education across the country, separate from what they might only hear from the few parents that they get to work with or what they read about in the press. So we sort of take that on as part of our work to make sure that they can have a pulse on where the conversation actually is among likely voters. So what we saw in this poll was, first of all, public K-12 education issues transcend partisan politics. There is consensus across party lines across this country that our public school system is systematically failing kids, and that it needs to be doing more to provide equitable opportunities for children across the country. Another thing that we saw was that it's an issue that people will vote on. 52% of people said that it was a very important issue to them when they thought about who they were going to vote for in this cycle and beyond. And when we asked them to sort of rethink the question in the context of your own community and the future of this country, that percentage went up to 63% who said that public education is an issue that they want to vote on. And the last thing I'll say that we're hoping to do another deeper dive on in the coming months is we saw a real generational gap between Gen Z and millennial voters and boomers and the silent generation across both parties. So Gen Z and millennial voters, Democrats and Republicans, are overwhelmingly pro-choice when described to them as the opportunity for parents to be able to make the right decisions for them and their families within their communities. They are overwhelmingly in favor of teaching history in a way that addresses systemic racism, even if that makes some students uncomfortable. They are Also, interestingly, it's supportive of unions, which we're reading to mean they don't buy into this false dichotomy of reform versus union. They actually believe in our public school system and think that we need to find ways to affect change, and that it is an issue that they will vote on. So there's lots of opportunity there for us to continue to dive into what that sort of under 40 set believes and how to help them take action on it.
Now, that under 40 set is not one that has been voting a lot in recent cycles. How do you get them to do that?
Yeah. I'd say for me, the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges facing us in 2022 and beyond is broadly under participation in municipal voting, particularly around school boards, right? Not just the under 40 set, but everybody. These are elections that people just don't turn out for, and we need to change that because that's really where votes can actually matter for your community. In terms of Gen Z, I would say two things. One, I will give a shameless plug for John Della Volpe's book on Gen Z. John did this poll with us. He's a pollster that we work with often and respect very dearly, and he wrote a book on Gen Z that is very interesting and that gives some hope that because of everything that they have gone through in their formative years, they are less likely as a generation to ultimately just adopt their parents' views. So hopefully some of what's in that book is correct. The other thing I'd say is the onus is on us, right? There is a real opportunity to help a generation of people who claim to care deeply about public education, who claim to care deeply about issues and about policy and want to be engaged, to show them a path to that engagement. And for me, municipal elections are a great way to do it because they'll be able to see their vote actually matter. These are low turnout races with small win margins. So if we can find a way to sort of capture that interest and get them participating now, hopefully we can keep that over time. And I really do think that's for all of us in this room and beyond to be thinking about in this cycle and beyond.
Right. So what could you learn from the poll that might help you understand how people are thinking about this election in November 2022? Now, more than a few people looked at what happened in Virginia last November and, were startled by the outcome, by the fact that education played such a critical role in the election of a new Republican governor in Virginia. Is there anything that you learned in the polling that has some pertinence or that might help us understand what's about to happen?
I'd say first and foremost, voters across the country are tired, frustrated, angry, sort of fill in the blank, and they are bringing all of that with them to the ballot box. Public education also is something that is at the forefront of people's minds in a way that it wasn't pre-pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. The pandemic gave everyone a window into it, whether you had kids or not, that we just didn't have before, and made it just a more salient, a more relevant topic for people. So I think that is part of why we're seeing it as an issue that people are voting on. What we saw in Virginia, we did some polling actually in partnership with Victoria after that election, and what we saw in our polling and our focus groups there was, as much as it was easy to sort of write it off as culture wars, it was actually much more about parents wanting to feel heard and wanting to know that public schools were going to be a priority and that keeping schools open was going to be a priority and that learning loss was going to be a priority. There is consensus across the voters that we polled in this most recent poll that we really need to be focusing not on culture wars, but actually much more on things like mental health supports and on financial literacy and civic engagement and sort of all the things that we think of as hopefully being part of a high-functioning public school system. That's what voters want and what they're hoping to hear when they get to the ballot box.
Do you think, that some of this angst that parents had over what was going on in their schools at that time in November 2021, is it as potent now as it was then, and will it be as potent next November?
I think parent angst persists. It is certainly not as... You sort of mentioned school closures and anti-masking. There was a lot of a different kind of parent angst, I would say, around that. But it's not going away. It's just finding other channels, other avenues. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's something that we need to very much keep an eye on as we look forward to this election and beyond, and is why I think we can expect to see somewhat greater turnout in some of these races. What we have to be careful of is that a lot of that angst is being channeled into sort of culture wars, flashpoints, right? Issues around, as you mentioned, sort of CRT, et cetera. And unless we collectively are doing a better job of articulating for parents for whom that isn't the issue, why they should care and why they should sort of channel their angst into voting in these elections, those loud voices will win, and we will actually see the culture wars be the deciding factor in these school board races.
Yeah. Before I move on to Derrell, there was one thing about the polling about Gen Z and millennials that did, I don't know, it made me curious. You made a very distinct, or came up with this very distinct finding that they're not following the tribal practices that boomer voters and those of, what do we call it, the silent generation beyond that. What convinces you that they won't grow up into their parents or their grandparents? Not that that's a given, but...
Well, history does have a way
does,
of... Yes. Again, I would say there are some indications that this is a generation that is shaped by things like school shootings and climate change in a very different way, that is sort of changing their beliefs and making them much more interested in solving issues than in following in their parents' footsteps to be more partisan. But I also think there's a lot of work that needs to be done by advocates across issues to continue to engage them so that that doesn't happen. It is not, I don't think it's inevitable, but it will require ongoing work.
Okay. It's good to have that hope. All right. Derrell, turning to you. I first off want to compliment you for something I saw on Twitter today. How often does someone get complimented for a tweet?
That's right.
But
You should have seen what I was about to tweet.
okay, all right. The self-editing function that not everybody exercises on Twitter is a very underappreciated art. So, no, but what I was going to say is that I do have a lot of respect for people who can pack a very interesting thought into, what is it now, 220 characters? Is that what we get these days? Elon Musk might know today. But you raised a really good question. You sort of took the title of this panel and twisted it a little bit. You wrote, is public education under attack? Maybe it depends on how you define attack. You remember writing that?
Indeed.
Okay. This was this morning. It might have been the caffeine talking, but tell me what you mean.
Yeah, so again, thank you very much for having me. It is delightful to see you all here in person. I'm still trying to figure out how to read social cues, so I just want there's a moment where you should laugh. If I don't get it, that's me. For me, the pandemic, let's say, pandemic, education, what came before, what came after, it sort of reveals lots of things. So I'm fond of telling people that in 2019, I don't do it fondly, but I do it often, of telling people that in 2019, 1 in 5 black fourth graders in America read at or above proficient on the NAEP. And half of the white kids. So that was with the system we had, running full bore, no shutdowns, none of this anything, right? And I feel like we have to embrace the fact that there are cracks in the foundation of the institution. Its politics, its product, like what it does, whose will it prioritizes, in elections, not in elections. If we ever want to get the system or systems of education that we feel we deserve, right, or that our kids deserve, or that help every person become the best version of themselves and help us all, meet the potential of our ideals as Americans. Some people would perceive that unvarnished view as an attack. Right? I just perceive it as the truth. And so you can have lots of different discussions with people about how much truth is necessary to get the thing that we feel like we all deserve, that our kids deserve. And opinions vary. Some people are like, listen, it's too much pain, we should just move on from it, right? And I just want to make sort of a point about this. Go ahead.
No, I want to hear the rest.
All right, I want to make a point about this because the polling says I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it. So there was this study at Yale, a psychology study back in the day, about how people perceive pain, right? and they give you like 10 shocks. They didn't give me 10 shocks, but you give a subject 10 shocks. And what happens is that people don't remember the worst shock or the least worst shock. They remember the average of the shocks, right? And I am concerned that people will remember the average of the discomfort or dysfunction of the last 2.5 years, which is really just sort of like a bleak expression of those things of the prior 25 years. And then all of a sudden we're having a conversation about like a 4.5 when we should be having one about a 9. So that was a great question, by the way.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you saying that. All right, let's talk about school boards a little bit and about school board elections. So when I think of what's going to happen in November, obviously the control of the U.S. House, huge mega story. Control of the U.S. Senate, I guess, is possibly up for grabs. But around the country, we know that there will be school board elections. There will be school board elections that do not get anywhere near the amount of attention that the House of Representatives or the Senate will. But we also know that there's been a lot of organizing going on. I know Murmuration has done some tracking of some of the groups that are, using whatever means possible to try to get candidates, many of them conservative candidates, on school board elections. So, Derrell, to what extent are you worried about just the politicization, if you will, of school boards?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't mean to be flip, but if you want to take the politics out of school board elections, you have to take school boards out of it, right? Because they're inherently political, And I do think one of the things that's important, and this is not like a horseshoe theory of school boards, but school board elections have always been of intense interest and focus, just not really to parents, right? There are lots of people, there are lots of interests that find themselves, converge, that's the word I'm looking for, in school board elections, right? And so teacher unions historically have benefited the most from having control over low turnout elections that happen in off cycles, right? And now we're experiencing a different expression of that political function around a different set of issues. So that's the one thing. The second thing I would just say that what I think is very different is that, and why school board elections are probably potentially more vulnerable to the political upheaval of the midterms, is because, and I think rightly, in lots of places we moved school board elections so that they would align with national elections in a way to improve turnout so that they were more democratic, right? And the fact that they are more democratic also means they are more vulnerable to distortions of democracy, right? So this fall, we could conceivably see different outcomes down ballot, and I know that like there's some places where you can actually run on these issues, right? You can run on CRT or whatever, and it might get you on the school board, and then you go on and do something else. In the Tony Berg of Jersey City, where I pay my taxes, that's not going to get you elected. But there are other things that are sort of equally important. I'm curious to see how it all pans out.
Well, I know that more than a few people have paid attention to Moms for Liberty recently. That's probably the biggest name out there. I can't imagine how much money they have at their disposal, but they have thousands of members in chapters all across the country. Should I be worried?
I guess it depends on where you are, right? I mean, if they're Moms for Liberty in Jersey City, they're really undercover. Look, here's the thing, and this is like, I grew up in a place where the only school I ever went to that was my zone school was my first one, right? So I'm very about like deleveraging sort of place from where people go to school. And honestly, Emma, I think one of the reasons why maybe we see Gen Z, like millennials, whatever, are more about choice is because they're less about place, right? Their lives have been about travel and crossing enormous distances using like social media and all these other things, whatever. So maybe that is one sort of hypothesis for this. But until we have a school systems, right, that are outside of the political bubble, which is maybe impossible, to me, like the more interesting question to ask is like, all right, I'm a parent, and I think that the people on my school board do not have the best interests of my child at heart. They are focused on the wrong things at a given moment, like what is kind of available to me. And like full disclosure, the school board members who were running in my town, right? And I vote in school board elections. I'm like one of 5 people. I wouldn't trust the child of my worst enemy with these people. So I wrote in Tony Stark, T'Challa, Diana Prince, right, and Steve Rogers, right? That's the amount of confidence I had in these folks. And so if that's because that is true, right? I didn't think they were about reopening schools. I didn't think they were particularly well situated to spend ESSER money, to intervene on any of the things that we're talking about, like what is available to me as a parent, and I think that's an open policy question right now.
Okay, all right. Victoria, I want to talk more with you about Democrats and politics. We'll get to the school boards in a minute, but let's talk about the midterms and your level of concern about what's going to happen in November.
Yeah, so I think, I don't want to make predictions because I've canceled enough vacations in the last 2 years to know that that's worthless. But I think, all the things for everyone who got to hear Emma at lunch, all of these and the concern she detailed before, right? Parents are frustrated. They don't feel like they're heard. In Virginia, we had this kind of perfect storm where you had one candidate who wasn't really having any kind of a substantial conversation about education and also had a honest gaffe about parents not having, shouldn't have a say in the, in their child's education. That rubbed parents the wrong way at a time when parents felt frustrated. Right, go figure. At a time when parents felt frustrated and like they weren't being heard. And we know from the polling that we did with Emma and Murmuration that, school closures, particularly for Democrats, was the most convincing reason why Democrats voted or considered voting for Youngkin. That was an incredible frustration. And the issues that Youngkin leaned into, which were quite frankly quite democratic messages, actually investing, increasing resources and demanding better performance from schools, very democratic. That resonated with 66% of voters across demographics, including 28% of Biden voters. And we've seen that, in Emma's and Murmuration's most recent polling, that, kind of the common sense policies are what's resonating. I think Democrats have a huge opportunity in the midterms if they heed these lessons and really lean into parent concerns and address the needs of the moment. We did some polling in our Colorado state chapter did some polling where they found the number one issue for parents in Colorado was supporting students with COVID recovery. And Democrats, more or less single-handedly passed the massive ARP funds to provide $168 billion in COVID relief for education. That's for K-12 and higher ed. That passed on party lines. That's more than twice the operating budget of the Department of Education. That's a huge amount of money. And then, as we've all noted, the status quo wasn't working before COVID. Didn't work during COVID, right? We need new ways of spending that money to help students not just recover from the pandemic, but to address, historical gaps for students, historically underfunded schools, make sure that every child is getting the unique supports that they need. And so Democrats can really take this opportunity to talk about, one, the incredible resources that have been invested and how those funds can be spent in innovative new ways to help students recover from the pandemic. And I think if Democrats can do that and can lean into it, they can be successful. That's a big if.
It is a big if. Was there anything about Virginia, though, where you say, okay, this is a lesson we need to learn? Or do you look at it like it was such a fluke, flawed Democratic candidate, a really, really big gaffe, Or were there really things that you could take away and say, we're not going to do this again?
Oh, I mean, Virginia was a strong example of all the things that we shouldn't do. But New Jersey was a very close election.
True.
Reasons.
Yep.
Same reasons. Parents are frustrated, and it's not just in Virginia. Parents across the country, I mean, I'm sure in this room we could do a quick poll. How many parents are frustrated, right? And if we're not supporting students, right, like why, I think, as Emma said, time will tell if education is a motivating issue come November. There's a lot of things that can happen. I certainly think the economy will be a big issue, but there's a lot that also will happen now with education. When test scores come out later this year, that they usually come out summer or fall, how are students performing? Parents are going to start to see the impact of the pandemic. That's why would you accept that? And you want leadership.
Yeah.
You want leadership who's going to make sure that they're supporting students.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so like plus 500, all of that. I just want to say this one other thing too. So lots of people wanted to. I wrote this piece in the Daily News about Virginia and New Jersey afterwards, and I too was like, it's not about CRT. To me, what happened there, in particular in Virginia, is that parents who thought that bundling the right mortgage took all of these problems off of your table found out that wasn't true. And what the response was, it wasn't like an embracing of, oh, I want school choice, or, oh, I want transparency. It was like, I feel betrayed, right? You've altered the deal, right? to do Darth Vader. And they were like, you're gonna pay for that, right? And Youngkin, he really Youngkin lucked into this, I think, picked the right message. McAuliffe fell over it because, like, if you're in a room full of people and you piss them off, don't piss them off again, right? And that was what he did. He leaned into it. He's like, "Y'all mad? Let me make you madder," right? And people took that to the ballot box. Phil Murphy squeaked by with the same thing. And I think that your point, Emma, earlier, there's a lot of unrest that's grounded in betrayal of like a big public system that people like manipulate through the housing market to get the right thing out of it, and nobody said, I'm sorry, right? I mean, that's really the thing. Like, no one has apologized for it, and until something unwinds that, I think that frustration is going to be waiting to come to the ballot box.
A number of commentators last week, the week before last, after the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Ketanji Brown Jackson, we're looking at that episode and looking at what Republican senators were saying, the attacks that they were using against her, and saying they were testing out messages for 2022. And there was a lot of CRT there. There were a lot of things that just kind of got, it was a significant replay, or it sounded like a significant replay of what we saw in Virginia. So it looks like that's a solid clue. They're going to go into battle with that in their arsenal. And you guys are going to go into battle with rescue plan. What else?
Well, I will say one thing on the CRT piece is that a lot of Republicans now, thanks to redistricting, their big race is the primary, and so this is kind of the purity test of how Republican are you.
Yeah.
So leaning into it now, I mean, for some Republicans, this is the way to differentiate themselves if there isn't really going to be a Democrat in the race. So I think that is skewing it certainly in some districts. But I think again the CRT we've seen over and over isn't the most important issue. It's far down on the list for voters. There's definitely a subset of voters, right, particularly Republican voters, where it's still a convincing issue.
That percentage is in the 20s.
Yeah.
And it's far lower among independents and among Democrats, right? I think if you're actually addressing the issues that parents care about, if they're able to see that you're helping their child, high impact tutoring is one of the most effective strategies for accelerating learning. It has 79% of voters support high impact tutoring. If you're investing in these types of evidence proven strategies, to support students, if you're investing in recruiting and retaining educators, mental health services. Parents can actually see tangible investments that are helping their children, and they feel heard. I think the attacks that they don't know what's happening in their school, that there's things that make them uncomfortable, won't resonate. And because those are the things that really matter, what is helping our students now to be, to be successful and to have, the opportunities that their parents dream of for them.
Yeah. I want to ask all of you what you think of when you hear the phrase parental rights. Emma, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think I hear a phrase that's on the one hand being co-opted to sort of mean parents get to make all decisions. And I think when we talk to parents and voters across the country, what it actually means is transparency and a feeling of being heard. And we need to distinguish between those two definitions and try to elevate the latter.
Okay. Derrell?
Some bullshit. Listen, I'm gonna keep it real. No, okay. So I think what Emma said is right on, right? And just again to go back to the election piece, if the ritual of sending your kid to school, right? Even if it's a terrible school, people have bought into the ritual because the ritual allows you to do other things, like go to work and this other stuff, right? And the fact that has been corrupted in a lot of respects, right? I think has had an effect on people, and people want to reclaim the possession of that normalcy, right? And that can feel like a right, right? Because look, you bought your house. Like, this has been a social compact. There are lots of things that where you go outside, people say this is a right. Public education is a right. Whatever, right? You can believe that or not believe it. It can be real or not real. People feel it. So for what it's worth, it's real. Okay. And I think addressing that is legitimate and real. When I look at like parents' bills of rights or whatever, there's like nothing there. And that's the thing that's so frustrating to me. There's no there, right? Like, I want to know what I'm going to be able to do as a mom, as a dad, or whatever, if you don't open my school, right? If you can't guarantee I'll have a teacher, right? If one day, I hate to pick on my colleague who's in the room, one day my teacher is in the National Guard, right? The next day, my teacher's a teacher, right? Like, if you can't give me any certainty, like, what are my rights? To me, those are the kinds of policy leverages we need to be talking about for parents, not like, oh, I get a published list of like everything my teacher grabs off of Pinterest. Like, and I want to make this one other, there's a thing out there today, teachers be up on Pinterest, all right? I know that site too. I was in par with that guy. So the one other thing I would say about this, because I know we're sort of up on it. We should absolutely redefine this into something that is real and actionable and about parents. So like reclaim it. Nobody cares what the name is, like, because I don't think we can win parental rights at this point. Like, to sort of reclaim the action. And the other thing is, like, don't be consumed by these vicious media bubbles that have us believing that 90% of the people in the country think that Ted Cruz did a good job during his Supreme Court interrogation. Because I'm telling you, most people are like, this is over the top, this is ridiculous, I don't want to see this. But those aren't the voices that this group is normally going to see or hear.
Agree with you there on Ted. Okay, Victoria, I got to ask you, you're a communications specialist, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm used to being behind them, off the side of the
right.
stage.
Okay, but the word parental rights,
yes,
as Emma said, truly has been co-opted, but it worked, and it can continue to work. And while what Derrell said is right, you got to put substance to it, and that you should be talking about the substance. How do you fight the phrase? That is something that really does concern me. Whether it's a tweet or a Facebook post or just a conventional old school television ad, those words are potent.
It's frustrating. And I wish I had a really easy answer. I think what one of the things that frustrates me with all of these parents' bills of rights when you're reading it, again, but besides lack of substance, is there, you deserve the right to know what's happening in your child's school. And on surface, like all of that sounds good, but the subtext there is you don't know what's happening in your child's school. Your child's school isn't safe. You don't know what it's like. It's seeding doubt for parents, and that feeds into that feeling of the lack of transparency or the uncertainty that parents are already experiencing. It's that like, wow, things are so much worse than you think. Like you need to have this Bill of Rights because your rights are being ignored and neglected. So I think the best thing Democrats, anyone can do, it's show, don't tell, right? If you value parents, and if you believe that parents have a right, to be, and they should, they're key critical stakeholders, along with educators, like we should be working together. Show, don't tell. Put some actions behind words, and like let's have a conversation. Let's work together to make sure that our schools are serving our students and our families.
Okay. Show, don't tell. This I'll put to any of you guys. All of you have significant interest in education reform and school choice. One of the perversions, I think, of the parental rights term has been this notion that essentially parents should be choosing curricula, picking the books, throwing books out of the library, whatever, however you want to frame it. How does someone say, okay, I am very much in favor of school choice, but not book choice, or class choice, or teacher choice, or those kinds of things?
I'll jump in briefly
Okay.
and then hand off to, Murmuration doesn't have a policy platform, so hand off to those who can really
Okay.
speak to the details of it.
I just think it's an interesting question that,
Yeah.
again, in the co-opting of messages is a
So,
tough one
so
to
we dug
challenge.
into this a little bit in our most recent poll, and parents still really trust their teachers, right? I mean, that is clear in all of the data that we're finding. And so, to me, you sort of question has choice been co-opted to mean choice down to the book level? That's not what parents want from choice, right? Parents want more like what Victoria is talking about, to know that their kids are going to a safe school that is providing them with a good education and is going to get them set up for life. And if that's not the school across the street, they want to be able to choose a different school. They don't, to Derrell's point, they don't have the time to be picking books and doing curriculum, and they trust their teachers enough to actually do it. So while trust in the overall system has definitely waned, overall parents believe teachers did everything that they could over the last 2 years, and they continue to trust them.
Okay. Victoria?
I mean, I would underline that. I think that parents trust educators, and they should. I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is like, all of our actions, as advocates, and need to be aligned on what's going to be best for students. What is the idea behind the choice is finding a high quality public school that supports every child's unique needs. I think that's, if there's book choice, like how is that serving what's best for our students? How are we making sure that they're having, you trust your expert, your teacher, who's, setting the curriculum, who's, curriculum is very much a local decision. And have those conversations. Again, like, let's work together, have the conversations, and then, our educators are the experts.
Great. Derrell, I'm going to change the subject really quickly. I'm being warned. We only have 90 seconds.
Get in there.
All right.
That's all good.
Okay, you can handle 90 seconds. All right, so the polling that Murmuration just completed does show that, okay, education is a topic people will vote on. Education is now vaulted into the 1, 2, 3, 4 level. How do we take advantage of this?
You have to have a compelling vision of the future that embraces the sort of pain and anxiety of the last 3 or 4 years, but that points to something better that meets our aspirations, will leave us more unified as a country, and that will help every kid become the best version of themselves. And to me, that positive vision is part of what is missing from the moment. If we can take the heat down enough to start talking about all the ingenuity and all the committed people and all the opportunity of a system that we could have, I think we can rationalize people and get them to vote on that.
All right, well, that's ending on a very upbeat note. Thank you for that. All right, thank you all.